Vladimir Putin has overseen nuclear weapons drills that Russia's military says were meant to test the country's procedure for authorizing attacks. The Kremlin says that exercise involved land, sea and air-based launches that included intercontinental ballistic missiles. At the same time, NATO also conducted its own annual nuclear drills this year for the first time in front of rolling cameras. DW's Katharina Kroll went to Focal Air Base in the Netherlands, where these NATO drills took place at a time of dueling shows of force between two traditional adversaries.
This is what NATO wants the world to see: a nuclear weapons training mission, usually top secret, now on show.
The openness will help us to understand for everybody in the public in NATO that this mission is important and it helps our deterrence.
These are some of the 70 aircraft involved in the exercise, which took place largely over the North Sea. The US is included in the 14 NATO allies taking part in the 2-week mission.
The mission is, in case of need, that we actually deploy nuclear weapons with this type of aircraft. And some other aircraft as well. So multiple dual-capable aircraft. And dual-capable tells as much as that you can do conventional attacks with it, but also nuclear attacks. And multiple countries in NATO do that.
For years, journalists wouldn't be given any information about this kind of exercise. But this year, NATO wants visibility. Why?
Of course, the real-world situation and the fact that we are open comes together, but it's not necessarily linked to that per se. But I think it also helps for the deterrence to be open about it and to speak out.
The exact scenario they practice remains classified, and the planes don't carry weapons.
Fake scenario, real message. That message is one of deterrence with the most terrifying weapons known to mankind. NATO wants to show if there's an attack, there will be a response. And the audience includes, of course, Russian President Vladimir Putin.
But potential aggressors are not the only audience this open exercise is aimed at.
Is it also a message to the people at the eastern flank of NATO, a sign of support?
I think that's the bigger part, the support to the people, and understand that for the NATO allies that we are capable of doing this and that we are ready and trained for it, that we can be as good as we can be to deter the people that would step into our countries and our NATO ally force.
NATO hopes it never needs to use this training, but the point of deterrence is to let the right people know they are ready if they have to.
Well, let's see if that works with William Alberque. He's a senior adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum, and that position follows 8 years working for NATO in the field of weapons of mass destruction and arms control, Washington, Brussels, and today he's here with me in Berlin. William, you've been deep in this topic for 2 decades. Do you see enough to be genuinely concerned right now?
The series of exercises that's happening right now between Russia and NATO doesn't really concern me. These are annual exercises that have been going on for quite some time. Steadfast Noon has been going on since at least 2006, and there was an exercise with a different name that went on long before that. GROM we see every October, late October. Putin himself oversees this. So in terms of signaling, this is very normal signaling. This is just making sure that the deterrence is working, that everything is going the way that it should, planning is happening as it should. So I don't see this as a symptom of any threat.
Now, NATO practice delivery of nuclear weapons every year, as you've mentioned, but isn't it slightly different this time?
It is. I mean, this is larger, 14 countries, more than 70 aircraft. It's a little bit more complex than it normally is, the number of operations that are happening over 2 weeks. But the biggest change is the transparency, the fact that journalists, that Deutsche Welle itself, was on site at a NATO exercise. You go back to 2021, you weren't even allowed to say the word Steadfast Noon as a NATO official. I didn't dream that we would actually have journalists watching the aircraft take off on practice nuclear strike missions for NATO with this kind of transparency. It's truly extraordinary.
Now, we hear a lot about NATO sending a message to its allies and also to Russia. Apparently, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said NATO nuclear arms drills lead to escalation of strategic risks and increased tensions. Is that the kind of message that NATO wants to send?
No, I think this is Russia doing its normal complaining, trying to find out if there are weaknesses in the alliance and to resolve. We haven't been, but it's the very fact that we haven't been very transparent about this. We haven't been very clear about this for years, and now we're being more confident, and that makes Russia a little bit more worried, and they'd like to see if they can push us back, if they can get us to back down. We've seen this bullying tactic throughout the years becoming more and more violent and repeated, but we shouldn't really take this terribly seriously. They're going to say these kinds of things, and I think that's okay.
Now, talking about messages, in the Cold War, we've come close to actual nuclear war at least 2 or 3 times. And I want to bring up Able Archer. Able Archer, there was a NATO exercise in 1983 that Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, mistook for actual preparations for an actual first strike by NATO. There were bombers in Russia and in East Germany sitting on the runway with nuclear weapons underneath their wings and running engines. How could a similar thing happen today?
I don't think so. Not between the US and Russia. Actually, so many lessons were learned in the Cold War. We have this mechanism called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where we exchange with the Russians when we're going to have exercises. The US and the Soviet Union negotiated a series of agreements, including on the prevention of nuclear war, where they notify each other when they have strategic exercises. And a lot of this came out of these sorts of things. There's also something called the Ballistic Missile Agreement, where the US and Russia tell each other before they launch ballistic missiles. So Russia would have notified the Grom exercise. They would have notified the ICBM and SLBM launch of the submarine.
Test fire.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. An actual attack they might not notify. But it's important that they notify tests, because then you don't think it's an attack. Then you can watch it. You can make sure you're prepared in case anything goes wrong. But these are the lessons that Able Archer taught us. I'm more worried about US-China, China-India, and India-Pakistan, because they don't quite have the same mechanisms in place. But at least between the US and Russia, between NATO and Russia, we've learned lessons. We've implemented them to reduce risks of this spiraling into some kind of conflict.
So you trust these mechanisms, but also Putin has talked about NATO crossing red lines, that certain actions could trigger Russia into the use of nuclear weapons. What is a red line for Russia? Do we know?
No, we don't know. And part of deterrence is, as Tom Schelling wrote in a paper in 1959, it's the threat that leaves something to chance. What you want to do is you want to make sure that someone's not testing your red lines, certainly. But with what Russia is doing is they're trying to use nuclear coercion. So what Putin is trying to do is use nuclear threats to change our behavior. Just like when the foreign ministry complained about steadfast noon, we're not going to stop doing steadfast noon. Similarly, Russia says, oh, it's a red line if you give them artillery. It's a red line if you give them battle tanks. It's a red line if you give them missiles. Every time Russia has wanted to change our behavior with Ukraine, they've used this threat of red lines. It's nuclear coercion. Deterrence is working very well, but Russia's attempted uses of coercion have been in mixed results. On the one hand, it has delayed some Western support for Ukraine. It's changed some of our behavior. But in the end, we find out that these aren't really the red lines. We know that the red line is direct confrontation between the US or NATO and Russia. And we're not there. We're not trying to do that. And so when Russia tries to use these coercive signals, they're not as effective. And I would really encourage Vladimir Putin to stop doing it, because it just doesn't work.
And so you're not overly worried right now. Thank you very much. The former NATO official and fellow at the Pacific Forum, William Alberque, here in the studio with me.